want to tonight, I was reading an article, and there was a passage from the 39th Psalm that was mentioned. There were actually 2 verses in that article that I read, and I got to thinking about something that I've been giving a lot of thought to lately anyway, and this lesson is one that kind of deals with that subject. I remember several times that BD and I had discussions over the fact, and sometimes in Bible class and sometimes in private, that you hear people sometimes say that I did the best that I could. And he said he wasn't sure that we ever did the best that we could. And he would bring that up occasionally. And I think that it's something that really is troublesome to everyone to stop and think, am I doing the best that I can? Well, since we are imperfect people, then I would suppose that we would reach the conclusion that in all circumstances we don't do the best that we can. Because after all, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13 says that God provides a means of escape with every temptation that is presented before us. So I guess if we did the best that we could, we would seize every opportunity to overcome temptation. Galatians 6 and 10 says, as we therefore have opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. And I know in my own life, and I would assume that you're the same, that there are times when something happens and afterwards I think, I had a great opportunity there and I missed it. So I don't know that we ever would be in a position that we would say that we've done the best that we can. David, on the other hand, was a little different than you and I. David was, among other things, a great poet. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but sometimes there are things that you think in your mind and they don't really move you much, but if you hear a song about that's poetry set to music, then it tends to be very moving and you tend to be very touched by it. So David had an ability that I really don't have. That is, that he could speak in a way, a poetic way, that really had a great impact upon us. The 39th Psalm, and I'm going to do something tonight I don't do often and do once in a while. We're going to confine ourselves to the 39th Psalm. This will basically be a commentary on the 13 verses of the 39th Psalm. When we begin to read this psalm, I want us to think a little bit about David. You know, David is a person that is probably, I would guess that if you were to say the top 4 best-known persons in the inspired text of the Old and New Testaments, David would probably be in that classification. If you look back to the book of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, every king that came into power as either the king of Judah or the king of Israel, I believe, would always be compared to David specifically. When you look into the New Testament, you find, even in the gospel being preached, that David is a very prominent part of that sermon that Peter presented on that day. He is a person that is very well known. As we've said before, probably the thing he's best known for, there are 2 things that he's best known for. One would be a very positive thing with the going out and going up against Goliath. In fact, that is something that is so well known even among very non-religious people that David and Goliath is kind of a proverb that we use when you speak of someone who is very small and very frail opposing someone who's very powerful and succeeding. And then, of course, the other thing that David is best known for would be the David and Bathsheba story, which is a tragic, tragic story that we've studied many times. You know, we don't know, and I was doing a little research on this, and we don't know exactly what point in time this particular psalm was written in David's life. Some of the psalms that David wrote, he actually identified the time in which he wrote them. The 51st psalm, for example, he wrote that after the scene with Bathsheba, so we know that. This particular psalm, we don't know exactly when it might have been written in his life. But there's one thing about David, if you examine him and you look at the Psalms as a whole, and this one specifically, the Psalms are really very useful to you if you read them, because I think David expresses a lot of the same emotions that we have, a lot of the same things that trouble us, that troubled him, and those are the things that he addresses. In this particular psalm, he seems to be addressing this idea of, have I done with my life all that I should and could have done with it? And that seems to be what this psalm is about. We're going to take it one verse at a time as we look at these lessons of David about life. And we're not going to read the psalm as a whole, but we're going to read it one psalm at a time and then comment upon that particular psalm. David begins by saying, I said, I will take heed to my ways, that I sin not with my tongue. I will keep my mouth with a bridle while the wicked is before me. I believe that when you read that particular verse, that what you see in David is something that you see in most people. Most people who have a sense of morality, who have a sense of responsibility toward God, think in their minds that I'm going to be obedient to God. I'm going to be useful in His kingdom. I'm going to do things that will actually be useful to other people in their search to find God. And I'm going to be very careful to maintain my life so that there are not things that intrude upon it that will destroy my reputation and destroy my relationship before God. I think that is a very common idea. Most people, if you ask them a question before they committed a violent crime, if they would have done that, they would say, no, I could never do that. Most people, before they become involved in arguments in which they say things that are just horrible, that really destroy relationships, probably have thought in their mind that I would never act in such a way. David makes a statement. I said, I will take heed to my ways, that I sin not with my tongue. I will keep my mouth with a bridle while the wicked is before me. And I don't know exactly what time this was in David's life. I don't know if this was before Bathsheba or after. It really seems to me that probably this was during the earlier parts of his life. And if that be true, then you come to the time with Bathsheba, and it's just inconceivable to imagine that a person would go from such intentions to such actions. But on the other hand, I think most of us in our lives would realize, now this is not something that can be observed from the outside, because after all, other people don't know you near as well as you do. You know yourself, and other folks don't. You know all the things you've been involved in all your life, and other folks don't. I think that every one of us would have to admit that we really have good intentions of doing that which is right, but it doesn't always come to pass. And that's something that troubles man, and I think it is troublesome. I think that if people are honest with themselves, that they would say that is a very troublesome thing. I have a hard time dealing with that. And I think that's exactly why David penned these words. Then he says this, I was dumb with silence. I held my peace, even from good, and my sorrow was stirred. You know, you stop and you think. What David did is he was contemplating his life and he was thinking at the things he had done. Now, you know, David is a person that is very prominent in the Old Testament. And yet, if you think of the words that are written about David, they're pretty brief. I mean, if you had a tract that thick and had 15 to 20 pages, everything written about him would be in that tract. I was reading something today that said that the average person speaks about, what was the number of words in a day? It was a large number. I can't remember, so I won't repeat it, but it was a very large number. And it said the average sermon would have, I think it said about 6,000 words in it. And the average tract that's written would have about 20 words, about 2,000 words in it. So what you see is that all that you read about David is still very limited. Just think about yesterday at Judy and David's 50th. They had the 50 years, but they had broken down into days and hours. And how many hours that is. That's a lot of hours. Now, if you try to record all those events and everything that happened there, it would take an enormous volume to accomplish that. I don't know how large the volume would be, but it would take an enormous volume. And so when you look at David and you say, we know so much about him, and we see only two things in his life that are really black marks on his reputation. And that would be the sin of Bathsheba and the numbering of the people at the end of his reign against the wishes of God. But David was in a different position than you and I. You're in a different position than I am when it comes to your life, and I'm in a different position than you are when it comes to mine. You know about me very limited things. I know about me everything there is to know. And so when I look at my life, I see a much different picture than you see. And when I look at your life, I see a much different picture than you see. So I understand what David is saying when he said, I was done with silence when I held my peace, and even from good, and my sorrow was stirred. I was troubled over what I saw. And then verse 3, he says something that's very interesting. He said, I found that the more I considered the divide between my intentions and my actions, the more he knew there was a problem. He said, my heart was hot within me. When I began to think about that, have you ever had a time, you probably can relate to what David is saying. Have you ever had a time when something happened that you really regretted? That was really something that you felt as if you just did not handle it correctly, that you had done the wrong thing, and that you may even have disrupted a relationship with someone that's very important to you, and that disruption may in fact last the rest of your life. Have you ever had that kind of time? And you sit down, you begin to contemplate that, and the more you think about that, and the more you consider it, the more it stirs your heart, and the more it troubles you. And that's what David's getting at. He said, I sat down and I began to think. And the more I thought, the more the fire burned, the larger it became. I would suppose that most people have had times in their life when things have happened and you've said to someone afterward, I just could not sleep last night. You think that's what David's talking about? I think it probably is. And times when you say, well, I just couldn't function properly. I think that's what he's saying. And I think he's expressing something that is something that all of us have experienced, but we, myself included, not being a poet, we can't probably put it in exactly the same way that David did. But then we come to the two verses that I read in the article that are very interesting verses. Verse 4 and verse 5. And David says, it was at this time that he realized something. He realized he needed to rethink how he viewed life. Now, I don't know exactly what point in years a person begins to think differently in their life, but I know that that does happen. I know that a very young person does many things without giving any consideration, and an older person would give a great deal of thought to it before they participate in the same thing. I know that to be true from experience. So at what point this is in David's life, I don't know. But here's what he did learn. Lord, make me to know mine end and the measure of my days, what it is, that I may know how frail I am. You talk about a powerful statement. Just think about that. Everybody needs to realize that this life is a very brief event. And when we begin to contemplate how we use it, and if we did the best that we could or we didn't with it, and we'd seized every opportunity we hadn't, we begin to understand that those opportunities and those things that we've done with our life, they're very limited because our life is limited. So you can do certain things, but the New Testament reveals this word says, actually the Psalm, the writer of the book of Proverbs said it, that in the grave there's no action. And that's what David is trying to get you to understand. He's trying to get you to think about it. When you begin to consider the way you live your life, the way you conduct yourself, the things that you're engaged in, the decisions that you make, you need to kind of look down to the end of it. And you need to take into consideration that, you don't have a great many opportunities. You really don't in the overall scheme of things. They're very limited by the years that you live. And David said, I need to understand how frail I am. I need to realize how limited I am. I need to realize that if I did do the absolute best that was possible for me to do, that it would still, in the overall scheme of things, be a very small thing. And I think that's something that David wants you to see, because if you can begin to view things in that way and begin to think in terms of the limitations that you have, it makes you take those things and consider them a great deal more important. I know, and you know, many people who've ended up in terminal situations who've really changed the way they dealt with everything because they understood better. And the older we get, the more we come to that position that we begin to understand that frailty. And we begin to understand how limited our days are and how short they are and how few opportunities we actually have. And it helps us to treasure them and to use them more wisely. And I think that's exactly what David had in mind. But then he says this. He said, behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth. You know, one of the things that David wanted us to do is to be very careful that we not overvalue ourselves. I think there are two problems that people have in life sometimes. Sometimes people undervalue themselves. I sometimes think back to Judas. Have you ever stopped to think of how different that story could have turned out? Now, the Apostle Paul went about preaching after his conversion, and he was so intense about grace and what it meant and how God was so good because he could forgive. If Judas had taken a different approach other than going out and hanging himself, if he had come to his senses and went back to the other apostles and said, I betrayed the Lord for 30 pieces of silver, and I repent of that, and I ask your forgiveness. From what I understand, he would have been forgiven. Is that not correct? Do you imagine the good he could have done? The opportunities he could have seized that would have been unique to him because of the situation that he was in? You know, we don't need to be careful we don't undervalue ourselves, but we also need to be careful we don't overvalue ourselves. Now think about David for a moment. I want you to consider it. He said, behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and my age is as nothing before thee. Verily every man at his best is altogether vanity. Now you may think that's a pretty gloomy statement, but it's a pretty realistic statement. Just stop and think for a moment. David was the first king that became a notable king in the kingdom of God. Saul, from the very beginning, was a king. He was the first king of Israel, but he certainly... Do you remember anything good that Saul did in his life? Anything? Can you remember a single good thing that's said about Saul? Probably not. David is the person that you and I think of, and we stand in awe of him. And yet he looks at himself and he said, every man at his best is altogether vanity. You stop and consider what he's saying. You know, he's learned a valuable lesson. Yeah, I'm the king. I'm the king. But you know what? Here's the truth. The psalmist said, and that would be David, later in the Psalms, that the days of a man's life are 70 or 80 years. Do you remember how long David lived? I can tell you, he lived to be 70 years old. I'm about to turn 70. So he lived to be 70 years old. 40 of those, he was the king of Israel. And yet he said of himself that you know what I've learned? At his best state, man is altogether vanity. Now, if you want to know why he would say that and why he would have that attitude, I want to remind you of something. I want you to read verse 6, and then I want you to consider something. Surely every man walketh is a vain show. Surely they are disquieted in vain. He heapeth up riches, and knoweth not who shall gather them. Now I want to give you a good illustration of exactly what we're saying here. Do you know what David's primary mission in life was? The thing that occupied a great deal of his time. He spent his entire time as king pretty much preparing for one event that he was never able to do. That was to build the temple in Jerusalem. Now, when he died, his son built that temple. Now, remember how David had worked so hard to maintain the unity of his kingdom. If you go back, you would be amazed at what David did and the grace that he showed toward people, because he was trying to tear down any difference between Judah and Israel. But when Solomon came to power, and here's David, and he's done all this and amassed all this wealth, and Solomon finally builds that temple. But where did Solomon worship at times? Not in that temple, but he worshiped in the idolatrous temples that he had built for his wives. You know, we sometimes will say something. We sometimes say, you know, so-and-so would turn over in their grave if they knew certain things. Well, I'm going to tell you something. If David looked back at Solomon's conduct, all the time he had spent in amassing things to build that temple, and Solomon builds the temple, and then Solomon himself builds temples to idols and actually goes and worships in them, he'd have rolled over in his grave. I think that's what David had in mind. He had in mind that what we have to understand, no matter how great we are, our life is brief. And when we're gone, then whatever impact that we're going to have upon the world we've had. Now, I realize the Bible says that Abel being dead yet speaketh. I realize that. But his example speaks. And I know of many people, and I know of many folks here. When I look at the pews here, the pews that are now empty because the people have passed away. And some of those people set great examples for me. But they're not the persons that are actually involved in the congregation now. Whatever this congregation is now, and whatever we accomplish now, will be because of what we do, not because of what they did. For example, Larry, we were here yesterday, and he said he could remember what the record attendance was when, I believe he said when he was a kid, that they once had 212 people in attendance here. I hope the floor was in better shape then, because that one we had wouldn't have held 212, I don't think, until we repaired it. I can remember counting here that we had over 100. 212 is a far piece. Can't remember. Of course, a lot of water's passed under the bridge since that time. A lot of cultural customs have changed. People used to go to church in the neighborhood next to them. Now they don't. We have a lot of people who drive to town. In fact, some of you who live in town drive here. But when you begin to think about all that, you kind of understand the point he's making. What we're doing, we have to be careful that we do the best that we can, but have an understanding that the next generation has their life to live. And they have their obligations to fulfill. And that we're not the end-all, be-all. And that's why he's talking about this idea of don't overvalue yourself, because think about this. David was the king to whom all other kings of Judah were compared. And when the final king of Judah was carried into Babylonian captivity, that king was a descendant of David. But he was a wicked, wicked man. So you stop and you consider and you realize what David is saying. He's saying that you can't overvalue yourself. You know, you're pretty limited. So now David begins to draw a conclusion. In fact, he said something, I paraphrased it. There is an expression that sometimes people use. What am I doing here? Some of you, I said something about Frogman Henry this morning. There was another fellow who had one hit song in all of his life. And he was actually a disc jockey. He ran across the street from the radio station, recorded the song, and then went back to work after it was over and made millions of dollars off the song. And the song begins with the words, "Please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go." And you may remember it. Basically, he's standing there saying, what am I doing here? In fact, I think those words are actually in that song. What am I doing here? Everybody has that tendency at times to look at life and ask the question, well, what is the point? And that's what David is asking. He's saying, what's the point? I mean, when I stop and I look and I consider, I'm trying and I fail so much and I don't do all the things I should do. And it troubles me that I'm not what I ought to be. And I realize that even when I've done what I can, that I really have no long-lasting effect. What am I doing here? And you know what he answers the question with? Now, Lord, what wait I for? I mean, why am I even here? And then he said this, and you need to pay attention to it because it's very important. My hope is in thee. So after all, let's ask a question. Think about it. I won't tell you the passage. I said I won't mention the other passage. So we'll just kind of look at them. We won't actually call them to your attention. Remember the Apostle Paul was talking about when a preacher went and preached, and he would convert some people, and some of those people would not remain silent. He said, you know, that if that happens, then these people don't remain faithful. I said the wrong word, like I said I do this morning sometime. Some of those people don't remain faithful, and so they fall away. And Paul is talking about how you deal with that. And he said, you know, what you have to understand, that if that's going to happen, and the person who preached the gospel is still faithful, he's going to be saved, even if those that he taught are lost. And David is kind of reaching that conclusion too. And he's saying, you know what? In the long run, I know that the only thing that matters is whether or not my relationship with God is such that I will be with him eternally. That's it. Nothing else really makes any difference when you get right down to it. And I think that's exactly what David wants us to understand. Now let's go a little bit further. He says in verse 8, you know, God can deliver me. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. Now, understand that when he's talking about deliver me from all my transgressions, I believe he's not talking about keep me from doing them. Now, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that he's saying forgive me. Because after all, he began this whole thing by saying, you know, I try to do it, don't live up to it, sometimes make mistakes, deliver me from all my transgressions, and make me not the reproach of the foolish. And in effect, if you look back and you think for a moment, you realize that's exactly what happened. When the prophet Nathan came to David after the sin with Bathsheba, told him the parable, got to the end of the parable, told him he was the one that the parable was intended for, and David said, I have sinned, and he said, God has put away your sin. And if you look to the last chapter of the book of, I believe it's Chronicles and Kings, where David numbered the people against the wishes of God. We just studied not long ago the sacrifice that was offered there at the threshing floor of Verona. And God set aside that sin. So he kind of understands that we are really dependent on God. That when it comes down to it, all of sin comes short of the glory of God. And the only hope that we got is that God is going to offer us the forgiveness of our sins based upon obedience to his will. And that's it. And David is pleading for that. But then he says this. I was dumb. I opened not my mouth because thou didst it. Now think about it. He had no reason to boast. I mean, after all, in the sin with Bathsheba, God said, I put away your sin. Did his sin cease to exist? Was there not a man dead because of his sin? He was still dead. Was there not a child born into the world that fell sick after this occasion and died because of that sin? Was there not a whole family, all of David's family, that kind of began with Absalom? And really, Absalom was kind of the biggest problem for some time. And then later you had the other problems in his life as well at the end of it. But, you know, all those things were there. And David said, I was dumb, opened not my mouth. You know what he really is saying? If you ever done something that caused terrible consequence, Do you believe that's the time for you to make excuse and try to explain why that happened? That's one of the big problems man has in the 20th century or 21st century. That nowadays, when people realize they did something terribly wrong, rather than just saying, like David did, I've sinned, God forgive me, they began to try to offer all kinds of excuses why this happened. David said, I was dumb. I opened not my mouth because you did it, God. You know, you delivered me from the transgressions. It wasn't me. I didn't have, as we would say, a leg to stand on. Can you not appreciate David? And can't you kind of see yourself in all the things that he says? You know, in verse 10, here's something David said. David knew that if God gave him what he deserved, he'd be consumed. So his only hope was in the grace of God. Remove thy stroke away from me. I am consumed by the blow of thine hand. You know, sometimes we have an instance of a baby that dies because a parent administers too strong of a stroke. In case of a small infant, there shouldn't be any stroke at all. But they just get upset, they get tore up, and they don't really understand how fragile that little creature is. And with one stroke, that baby dies. Now, if you compare yourself with God in power, you don't even measure up to that small baby with a 200-pound father. You don't even come close. I mean, God could destroy you so quickly that it would require no effort. We sometimes say somebody could whoop somebody with one hand tied behind their back. God can completely tie everything he has, and he can speak himself. You have no power. And that's what David has in mind. He's saying, you know, I don't have any excuse for my actions. And the only thing that I have any hope is the grace of God. And you and I, you know, we have to have the same attitude. We can't go around trying to excuse something we did that was wrong. We just have to say, okay, it's wrong. I've sinned. And ask God to forgive us. You know, I sometimes think about the Apostle Paul, because the Apostle Paul was a lot like David. I sometimes think about those 3 days that he spent in Damascus by himself after he'd encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus and been told to go in the city to be told what he'd do. And I sometimes think of how what Paul experienced was very similar to what you read in this psalm. Very similar. Think of how he must have felt as he thought of all the people that he killed in prison, taken their possessions, disrupted the Lord's church, did everything he could to cause the gospel to not be preached. And all of a sudden he realizes it was all a mistake, and he's got 3 days to sit and think about that before Ananias ever comes to talk with him. I began to understand what David has in mind, and I believe I understand a little bit of what the Apostle Paul. I've never experienced that kind of situation. But David recognized that he was, as we would say, no match for God. In verse 11, he said this, and it is an interesting thought. When thou with rebukes doth correct man for iniquity, thou makest his beauty to consume away like a moth. Now, there are other translations that say different things, but this is a poetic figure of speech that's used in the King James translation. Surely, every man is vanity. I don't know why the King James translator chose the moth. I don't know. I do know this. I was at a service station. We say that. They're really not service stations anymore. They're not even gas stations. They're convenience markets with gas. But anyway, I was at one of them getting some gas one night. And I saw something that got me so excited. Don't remember anything, but I don't think I had a cell phone. I had to run home and tell Pat about it. Had to tell somebody about it. I saw a moth that looked like a jet fighter plane with the camouflage. You ever seen one? That thing is a beautiful thing to behold. I mean, it's a big old moth, and it looked like It looked like somebody painted it, just like one of those fighter planes that you see on TV, and it just amazed me. You know how long a moth lives? I don't, but it's not very long. That beauty is very short-lived. And then what happens? Well, after he fell on the ground and you stepped on him and walked on him, he doesn't look so beautiful any longer. And David uses that expression to say, if you were to take man and God rebukes him for all of his iniquities and exposes them, he makes his beauty to consume away like a moth. You know what would be interesting? What would be interesting if we went to a man's funeral who was a very godly man, who had lived his life in trying to serve God faithfully, if God were to give us an actual accounting of every thought he ever had, every deed he ever did, just think of how his beauty might melt in a moment of time. And I think that's what David had in mind. He's saying, you know, when you rebuke man and you correct him for iniquity, you make his beauty to consume away like a moth. Sometimes we use the language that when a person really chews someone out, we say that they melt them. Well, I can tell you when God speaks, I can remember. In fact, there's only one time that I can ever remember in Scripture that God spake to a large crowd of people in a forceful manner. And that was at Mount Sinai. And God actually spake the Ten Commandments to the people orally before he gave them to them. If you read chapter 19, he spoke them orally. And when God spoke to those people went to Moses and they said, don't ever let God speak to us again. It's too frightening. And I sometimes think that that's really what David had in mind when he's talking about, you know, if God corrects man. I look at some of the things that people say that are reported in the news today, and it makes me cringe when that person has to stand before God in judgment and give an answer for what they've said. Their beauty is going to melt like a moth. But let me tell you something. That applies to every one of us. To all of us. Because we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And there are things, I'm sure, that you would not like to have repeated in public company. Verse 12. Hear my prayer, O God, O Lord. Give ear unto my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears. For I am a stranger with thee, and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. You know, when David is calling upon God to save him despite that he, like all his fathers before him, see, that's what he said. All my fathers. This is a common affliction of mankind. I'm just a man. And I understand the mistakes that I've made in my life and the sins that I've committed. And I'm asking you to hear my prayer, give ear to my cry, and don't hold your peace. Have you ever seen, you ever watched a movie? I actually was watching a rifleman last night, and it kind of presents this situation. There was a fellow on there who was a hangman. That was what he did, one of the things he did. Every time somebody was convicted of a crime, he had a private gallows and he hung them for the city of Northport. And he murdered someone himself and had done it in such a way that he could frame another individual, and he was preparing the gallows so that he could hang the other man. And he was treating that very lightly, like there was nothing to that. But then it was discovered that he actually had committed the crime. And as they drug him away, he, like a baby, was crying and blubbering, don't hang me, don't hang me. That's pretty similar to what David is saying. I'm pleading with you, God, listen to me. Don't turn a deaf ear to me. I realize I don't deserve a hearing. I understand that I'm a stranger with you, and I'm not what I should be, but I'm asking you for your mercy, and most importantly, for your grace. In verse 13, is kind of interesting because you've been looking at something that's kind of looks hopeless. You've been looking at something that looks like a terribly hopeless situation. And then all of a sudden David says this. He asked God to help him understand these truths. God, help me to understand this. Help me to understand all these things I've been saying. Spare me, that I may recover strength before I go hence and be no more. He said, you know what? You help me to be useful, to seize the opportunities, not to leave things undone as I might have done in the past, so that I'll be prepared to stand before you in judgment. You know, if you stop and you consider the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the conversation that the rich man had with Abraham at the end of that parable is very similar to this. He said, you know what? I resisted it and I've lost the opportunity. But I have 5 brothers. And I want you somehow to send someone and inform them of what I've learned so that they won't come to this place. But there is a problem with that. You know, here's the truth. Remember what David said in the earlier part of this psalm. Here's the truth. There's only one person that you control. Only one person you have anything to do with their eternal destiny. Only one. No one else. Now you may influence someone. You may teach someone. But you cannot obey for someone. You can't do that. And David is impressing that here. Before I go. Now someone might say, well, that's a pretty selfish statement. That's not a selfish statement. He's recognizing that, you know what, I have an opportunity. Other people have opportunities. But I can't seize opportunities for other people. I have to seize opportunities for me. I read this psalm. It impressed me. I hope it impressed you. And I hope it's not a waste of our time. Think about it. You know, in your life, it's yours. God gives it to you. You know, I don't know if people really stop to realize it, but the parable of the talents is really put there for a reason. Because when God entrusted, when the Lord and the master of the house entrusted the 5 talents, the 2 talents, and the 1 talent into the hands of these men, He didn't give them any specific instructions. He said, here they are. Use them in my service. That was it. That's kind of the way it is in their life. God gave it to you. And you're a free moral agent. And whatever you do with it, God's not going to restrain you from that. He's not going to stop you from that. He's going to allow you to do that. And whether it's a road to destruction or whether it's a road to salvation, He's going to let you take that road. He's not going to intervene in that. David understood that. We need to understand that. Think about it. We need to think about our relationship with God. If we've never obeyed the gospel, we certainly need to. If we have, we've been baptized for the remission of sins and we've sinned the public way, we need to correct that. But this lesson is one that probably deals with another thing that David said. I believe in the 51st Psalm when David said, keep me from secret sin. There are a lot of things that we need to deal with in our life that are not things that have to be dealt with other people. But we must deal with them. And I think that's really a lot of what David is talking about in this situation. You know, there's only one constant companion you have in life. Now you have, if you're married, you have a wife or a husband, and they are a companion, but they're not a constant companion. If you have children, they're a companion, but they're not constant. If you have friends, they're companions, but they're not constant. No matter who they are, they're not constant. But God is an absolute constant companion. So consequently, there's only one person, if you want to use that language, that understands you completely, and that's God. So make sure that your relationship with Him is based upon truth and sincerity. That's really the message that David has. Think about it as we stand and sing the song select.